We have entered the period of time of the Jewish calendar known as the 3 weeks, today being the 17th day of Tammuz. We begin a period of increasing sadness and reflection, which bridges today's date, the 17th of Tammuz, which happens to be the date on which the Jewish people worshiped the golden calf, 40 days and nights after Shavuot. And it continues through the next 3 weeks and culminates in the fast of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which is the Hebrew calendar date for the destruction of both the first temple and the second temple. So this period of time is associated with the concept of Churban, of destruction. And destruction in Jewish terms means creating distance between ourselves and God. So in a certain sense, on the 17th of Tammuz, as we enter the 3 weeks, we're marking a day in which we disrupted or put an end to the special elevated status we achieved when we stood at Har Sinai, when the Jewish people stood on Mount Sinai on the 50th day after leaving Egypt, when we were elevated to such a pristine level. And then 40 days and nights later, in despair that Moshe, our leader, would not return to us, the Jewish people worshiped a golden calf and they returned back to a level of distance from Hashem. And Tisha B'Av itself, which is deemed to be the saddest day of the Jewish year, really commemorates the flip side of that coin, where God withdrew God's presence from amongst the Jewish people, symbolized by the destruction of the first temple and the second temple. And in the eyes of the rabbis, it's understood to mean the temple itself, a place of such tremendous holiness, was indestructible. And it was only when God removed God's presence and connection from such a place that it could physically be destroyed. And that's what happened twice on the 9th day of Av. And this is the period of time we're entering. What is talked about very often is rebuilding a sense of unity, Avat Yisrael, connection amongst the Jewish people, and appropriately themes such as minimizing evil speech and Lashon Hara are addressed, and other efforts are made to emphasize the beauty and the strength and the merit of Jewish unity. I want to take a look at this week's Torah reading, Parshat Pinchas, which is always read either just before we enter the 3 weeks or as it is this week early on in the 3 week period. And look for some keys here that we're going to dig a little deeper, looking for a basis, for a fundamental basis that we could build Jewish unity on. So let's spend a few minutes looking at the Torah reading this week. It's Parshat Pinchas. It begins in Numbers, the book of Bamidbar, chapter 25, sentence 10. It's found on page 876 in the Art Scroll Stone Chumash. And it basically has 4 overall topics, and we're going to look at really 3 of the 4 briefly. The first is a synopsis of, connected to last week's Torah reading, where God rewards or acknowledges the incredible heroism of Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron, the high priest, who interceded at the end of last week's Torah reading at an ugly event when the daughters of Moab were seducing the Jewish people and again bringing us down to a lower level, creating more distance between us and God right on the cusp of entering the land of Israel and conquering it. And Pinchas intervened by taking a spear and killing Zimri, who was the leader of the tribe of Shimon, who was cohabiting publicly with one of the daughters of Moab. And he ended the plague by doing that, saved the lives of the Jewish people, and he's rewarded with 2 things, with a Brit Shalom, a covenant of peace, and with a Brit Kunat Olam, and he's elevated to the status of being a Kohen, and just a technicality because he was born before Aaron, and Aaron's sons were elevated to be a Kohen. So as a grandson, who was already born, he would not have been considered a Kohen, but he was elevated to that status in reward to what he did. The second section is the census of the Jewish people, where again, the Jewish people are counted. And here they're being counted on the cusp of entering the land of Israel, in a certain sense, really mustering their troops for the entering into the land and the conquest of the land. The third topic is this appointment of Yehoshua by God to be the successor leader of Moshe. And the fourth is a detailed list of offerings, daily offerings, Shabbat offerings, Rosh Chodesh, all the holidays of the year, Pesach, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeret. And oftentimes on the holidays, we read sections of this week's Torah portion because they contain the offerings for that holiday. So let's focus in now on the parsha, on the first part, which is the reward promised to Pinchas. And Pinchas is ultimately deemed to be a zealot, a kanoi, which is oftentimes misunderstood, and hopefully we'll refine that understanding here in the next few minutes. But he was one who was so hyped up and so purely motivated to protect God's dignity in the world. That's the specific definition of being a kanoi, not a hot-headed person, not a person whose blood boils quickly or who acts without a lot of thought and reflection, but rather a person who is deeply motivated by the honor of Hashem. And after all, God describes God Almighty as a keel kana, a jealous God. And in Hebrew, the word kanaut, zealousness, is related to that idea of being protective of the honor and dignity of God alone. So we focus in right away that the Torah unusually says in the beginning, page 876, chapter 25, it's sentence 11, Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen. So we know who Pinchas was because he was the actor in the previous portion of this chapter, but it says he was the son of Elazar, who was the son of Aaron HaKohen. And this is extraneous extra identifications that are here. So what do we have this for? Rashi explains, based on the Gemara, that there was an active debate amongst the Jewish people how to properly view Pinchas and how to view the action he took in ending the plague by killing, justifiably killing Zimri, a prince of the Jewish people, the leader of the tribe of Shimon, and the Moavi woman, and he killed them in a manner which demonstrated the fact that he was ending their illicit liaison and therefore quieting the wrath of God against the Jewish people who were suddenly awakened through a plague to the notion that what they were doing was completely immoral and corrupt, something that they had not been quite aware of to the extent that they should have been. So there was a debate. People were angry. Who was Pinchas? How dare he take it upon himself to kill one of the 12 Nisim, one of the 12 princes of the Jewish people? And in fact, the people who were attacking Pinchas and disparaging of his argument said, you know, Pinchas is? He's the son of Elazar. And who's Elazar married to? Elazar is married to a daughter of Yitro, just like Moshe was married to a daughter of Yitro. And therefore, he's a descendant from idolaters, and he's probably a rash, hot-headed, conflicted person. And how did he have the audacity to stand up and to commit the act of murder in their eyes that he committed in front of the Jewish people? To which God responds and calls him Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron HaKohen. And we know that Aaron, his grandfather, is designated as the person who is Oev Shalom, was a lover of peace, Rodev Shalom. He chases after peace. And his main goal is that there should be unity and love amongst the Jewish people. And indeed, midrashically, we're told that Aaron was more beloved than was Moshe in the eyes of the people, because Aaron, the high priest, in addition to his duties ministering in the Holy of Holies and on behalf of the Jewish people, spent his time settling disputes, helping husbands and wives achieve shalom bayis and peace in their home and tranquility. And whenever he heard of a dispute, he intervened in a manner to settle the dispute amicably so that the Jewish people should be unified. So this beginning of this parsha is God answering the suspicions and the attack against Pinchas by saying, you know who Pinchas is? Yes, he's the son of Elazar, but Elazar is the son of Aaron HaKohen. And Pinchas's action was pure and holy and totally on behalf of protecting the honor of God and stopping the plague that was decimating the Jewish people. That's what the Torah is coding in here. That was the true source of his action. So this brings up to us in our minds the concept of being done l'kav zchus, that you can judging people favorably. In this case, it would seem from the Torah that without God speaking out loud, so to speak, to the whole Jewish people and identifying the ultimate true pure motivation of Pinchas, there would have been quote unquote historical ambiguity as to whether Pinchas was just a hothead, whether he was a hypocrite, because after all, if he was a descendant and he carried within him attributes of idolatry, how dare he get up and put an end to a travesty taking place amongst the Jewish people when he couldn't possibly represent the grandeur of the Jewish people? God settles the score. God tells us this is the piercing ultimate judgment. And also there's a message here which tells us the following. The message tells us that who knows the ultimate motivation of people? Now, in the field of Musar study and introspection and being thoughtful as we are asked to do during this period of the 3 weeks, we have every right to question our own motivations and to look within them and in a sense, clarify and purify them for ourselves. When it comes to other people, our job is to find positive trends of thought and to understand other people's motivations in their light. And I'll just tell you a joke. It's a Hasidic joke, but it's attributed to a Hasidic Rebbe who lived several hundred years ago. The name of his writings were Avas Yisrael, love of the fellow Jewish people. It's a joke on last week's Torah reading. And he says, I see love of your fellow man in every portion of the Torah. He says, look at the name Balak, the evil king who hired Bilam to curse the Jewish people. If you look at his name, Beit Lamed Gimel, I see B'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Now that the joke is because it doesn't match. So the Hasidim say, excuse me, Rebbe, it's V'ahavta with a Vav. You're right, the Lamed could be l'reacha, but kamocha is not spelled with a kuf like Balak's name is spelled. It's spelled with a chaf. So you only have 1 out of 3. So the Rebbe said, that's the secret of loving your fellow man. You can't look at him too closely. You have to just get an impression of what he's all about and hold on to a favorable impression of the other person. And in that way, you can live peacefully and harmoniously and be a force for good amongst the Jewish people. Now, obviously, this week's Parsha is God speaking and God being the ultimate authority, knowing the depths of the heart of each and every person and understanding us as unique individuals. So it's not a joking matter, but it awakens us as we enter this period of the 3 weeks. And as we try to formulate within ourselves a deepening of a love for our fellow man, and specifically a sense of unity and a sense of friendship and a sense of receptivity for our fellow Jews, many of whom aggravate us in such profound ways with their ideas, their philosophies, their ways of life, whatever, the way they look, the way they dress. the way they vote, whatever it is that is annoying in other people. So there's a sense here that God is setting for us an example. I can look ultimately within the human heart and I can determine whether Pinchas' true motivation was for the shame shamayim, for the sake of heaven, or whether they were personal and hypocritical. And I'm clarifying once and for all here that his motivations were pure, but you can follow suit. And you can follow suit in a forked manner. When it comes to yourself, question your motivations and find the purity within yourself and emphasize it to yourself. And when it comes to other people, make assumptions that their motivations are pure. Otherwise, you're subtly and subconsciously building a case against them, which ultimately is a root cause of the divisiveness and the lack of unity and the lack of love we have for one another. That's a big lesson. And in the discussion of this idea, Rabbi Shlomo Yonasan Harris, a couple of years ago in a piece, he quotes a Mishnah in Yuma, and this will be the second part of this section of the class. The Mishnah describes a situation where the rabbis at the end of the second temple implemented a system where instead of in the morning, the Kohanim waking up early and rushing into the temple and trying hard to be the first one to clear out the ashes, do the dirty work of cleaning up and preparing the Mizbeach, preparing the altar for this day's Korbanot. It used to be first come, first served, and there was excitement and people would vie for the honor. But an ugly incident happened at the end of the second temple. It was observed by Rav Tzadok, and Rav Tzadok we know is the person who was saved by Roman doctors because he was at the request of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So it's the very end. It's not a happy time in terms of the unity of the Jewish people. So what happened? Two Kohanim were racing up to take the ashes off of the altar. And one, in an attempt to just hold back the other, actually stabs him. And he's lying, bleeding to death and dying in the temple itself. And then to make matters in a profound sense worse, the father of this dying Kohen comes, sees his son dying, realizes that he can't do anything to save his life, but he takes the knife out of him so that it shouldn't become tamei, it shouldn't become ritually impure from a deceased inside the temple. And the rabbis go bananas there. They have a whole debate. Does this show that the Jewish people had a special sensitivity to the holiness of the temple? And they conclude resoundingly, no, it does not. It shows the fact that human life was devalued and not held in such esteem. And this father, who you might construe as being a righteous person, so imbued with his concern for the purity of the temple, in fact, was a Kohen who had become dull and not responsive to the ultimate tragedy of a human being's life being taken frivolously and incorrectly. The outcome was that they set up a system where they appointed a Kohen each day to clear out the ashes, and that's why the Mishnah records it. But you see here the same type of debate. Was this father righteous, or was he the opposite of being righteous? Was he motivated by great reverence for the honor of God and the sanctity of the temple? Or was he lacking in his appreciation for the value of every human life and not realizing the ultimate tragedy of someone taking someone else's life for a religious, zealous moment where I wanted to be the first one to be able to clear out the ashes and honor God? So we see again this echo of the same idea, that there's room for us, especially to curb our enthusiasm for seemingly righteous matters when it intrudes and pushes aside our very concern for the lives and existence of our fellow Jews. And indeed, just a comment, if you look at Rabbi Shamshin Raphael Hirsch in his discussion in Chorev about the mitzvah of loving your fellow Jew as yourself, v'yohavta l'reacha kamocha, you'll see there that he says, when we have a starting point that the world revolves around me, and therefore anything or person in the world that likes me, respects me, looks up to me, helps me, it benefits me, that person's great. And anyone who's in my way, so to speak, because I want more, or I want to have the best car on the block, or I want to, whatever need I have, that person becomes a thorn in my side. And to the extent even that I could think, well, the world would be a better place without that person. He says this is a dynamic as the bedrock of the mitzvah of v'ohavta l'reacha kamocha. It's a very stark, very revelatory insight that he puts forward. And I think if we use that as we look at this section of the Parsha this week, Parsha Pinchas, and we understand it is very difficult to pinpoint with certainty someone else's motivation, even our own motivation. So we can work to perfect ourselves, and we can work to learn to love and value and give the benefit of the doubt to others. And this is a great attitude to hold on to as we enter the period of the 3 weeks, this tragic period, which, as I say, bookends with us distancing ourselves from God by the worshiping of the golden calf, and ultimately this distancing leading for God to make God's presence absent from amongst the Jewish people by God withdrawing from the temple and leaving it as a pile of stones rather than a place of holiness. Even more intriguing, this is part 2 of the class. Zimri himself, the man who was killed by Pinchas. So the Or HaChaim points out something which is astounding. If you go back to chapter 25, it's sentence 14, again on page 876 in the Stone Chumash, V'shem ish Yisrael hamukah asher hukah Midyanis Zimri bat Saru. The name of the slain Israelite man who was slain with the Midianite woman was Zimri, the son of Salu, leader of the father's house of the tribe of Shimon. The fact that he's called Ish Yisrael, the Or HaChaim points out, means that his being killed by Pinchas atoned for whatever wrongdoing he was guilty of, and therefore in death he returned to the status as an Ish Yisrael, a member of the Jewish people. And there's a lot of detail in understanding this, but it's actually reinforced in the second part of this Torah reading, which is the census of the Jewish people. And just something interesting to point out about the census, which we should all notice. If you turn to page 880, which is chapter 26, where we have again a detailed census of the Jewish people. And frankly, these censuses don't seem to attract our attention very much as they're read in the Torah reading. But if you look at chapter 26, sentence 5, page 878, it says, it identifies the families as Bechor Yisrael, Ruvain Bechor Yisrael, Ruvain the firstborn of the Jewish people, the children of Ruvain, Chanoch, the Chanochite family. And the way it's in Hebrew, it's Chanoch Mishpachat HaChanuchi. What's added to the name Chanoch is a Hey at the beginning and a Yud at the end. And Rashi questions why the Torah uses this format. And the backstory, Rashi says, is that the Jewish people, even after having been enslaved in Egypt for 210 harsh years of oppression and 400 years in total, the nations of the world approached the Jewish people, and again, to make light of them, to ridicule us, to put us down, to demean us in the eyes of the world, said, you think that you're a child of Reuven, a child of Shimon, a child of Levi. Who are you kidding? You went through generations of enslavement and oppression. You don't think your women weren't routinely abused by the Egyptian men, you think you're really a descendant of Reuven or Shimon or Levi or the Jewish tribes. Your family line must be so polluted. And again, it's raising the specter of hidden matters that no one could ever unwind. So, what does God do here? God actually adds a hey, the, to describe the family, and a yud at the end, ha chanuchi, instead of the name Chanoch, ha chanuchi, in order to say I'm adding my name to each family designation to show the purity and holiness. That the fact is that throughout the period of Egyptian slavery, the morality of the Jewish people remained intact, and that in fact every descendant from this family is in fact directly a descendant from Reuven, Shimon, Levi, the very founders, the Shvatim, the children of Jacob. There's a purity in the Jewish people. And then when it comes to the family of Shimon, Zimri is alluded to with the Hey and the Yud in the front, again, to say God's saying there's purity here. How could we say there was purity? A long story played out by the Midrashim, but that Shimon, that Zimri himself in committing this act had a pure motivation within his motivations. And that motivation was if his entire tribe was sinning with these women, he wanted to take an action that perhaps could protect them, even if it would cost him his life. His action did cost him his life, but there was an element of self-sacrifice on behalf of the Jewish people. Okay? It's an unusual medrash based on clear textual analysis, which is substantial, but it also shows the idea how even a person singled out as Zimri is for evil could, in the eyes of God's ultimate understanding, find enough purity of motivation so that in his death he returned and he should always be called an Ish Yisrael, a member of the Jewish people. And I want to briefly then move on to the appointment of Yoshua as the successor. And if you turn to page 889, which is where this takes place, it's where God for the first time designates, and actually I left out a section here which had to do with the daughters of Tzlavchad, which is an important part of this week's Torah reading. So we are passing that by, and I don't want to leave that unsaid because the daughters of Tzlavchad were true lovers of the Jewish people. But if you look at sentence 27:15, it says, Moshe approaches God, page 889 in the Stone Chumash. May Hashem, God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the assembly. In Hebrew, it's Elokei Haruchot Lechol Basar, an idea we've discussed before. And here, in an unbelievable moment in the Torah narrative, Moshe is specifying if a person is going to succeed me as the leader of the Jewish people, he has to be a person who sees God as the individual God of each and every individual person. Elokei Haruchot Lechol Basar, the God who ultimately deals with, recognizes, and appreciates the individuality of each and every person. And God who, so to speak, deals with, interacts with, and judges each individual in a manner uniquely suited to the makeup of that person. Quite a demand for someone who's leading, in this case, a few million people, quite a demand even on a mother or a father with 2 or 3 or more children to be able to have the kind of insight and attention and mindfulness in dealing with each of their children distinctly and individually. What does Rashi add here? Rashi says, we know no two people are the same. Appoint a manhig, a leader, sheyehi sovel kol echad v'echad, someone who's tolerant of. And the word sovel, Rav Luchter, in an important discussion, points out, it doesn't mean I tolerate you I'm not angry with you. I'm not yelling at you. I'm not fighting with you. That's the way we think of tolerance. I'll keep my distance from you. You don't buy your meat at the same butcher that I do. So obviously, I'm not going to eat in your house. Obviously, I harbor suspicions that your house isn't really as kosher as it should be or as mine is. Whatever petty, pathetic ideas occur to us in the course of human events. But I'm going to be a big person. I'm going to be Sovil. I'm going to be tolerant. I'm not going to hold it against you, so to speak. No. Savranut, he says, comes from restraint. When a person is Sovil something, when you bear something, it means you restrain your reaction, your personal particular reaction, and you understand that there is a God who's the God of each and every individual person. And although my individuality finds a lot of discomfort when I interact with the individuality of that other person, God finds a way to maintain an ongoing relationship with them, just as God finds a way, in spite of my own inadequacies and foibles and faults and particularities, to maintain a relationship with me. And I think here we're really looking at and uncovering and revealing the key to us entering successfully this period of the 3 weeks and finding our footing with one another and finding a real basis to achieve Avat Israel. For us to realize that my reactions to every other human being are personal and particular. Yeah, I like people who like the music I like, to use a petty example, or who root for the team that I root for. But if with savranut, with self-restraint, I will not only just acknowledge the idea that there are good people who root for the team that I'm against, but I realize the fact that this is a petty, particular bias on my part, and that there is a God in the world who's big enough and individual enough and encompassing enough to have love and favor for me and for this other person at the same time, and that I can learn from God. Perhaps I can learn from God to do the same thing if I work on it, if I take it to heart, if I think about this more. And perhaps this approach to life and to one another will enable us ultimately to achieve a sense of unity, which would be a tremendous, tremendous merit for us to see the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash and the return of the Jewish people to the unified nation of God as we're meant to be. Thank you very much.